I wasn't going to use the I word, and then now it's.
Well, now you because I used it.
All right, yeah. So now it's just a thing. Indexicality. Everybody knows what that is, and we should talk about it more. So I want to thank everybody who invited me down here to give this talk, and I want to caution people who are here in the audience that I've been working with documentary video games for a while, and essentially have started to kind of shift focus onto games that have this element of this captured element or captured qualities to them. A lot of the work I'm going to show, probably different from a lot of the other indie tech demos, is super early stuff. So like really early sketches and even things that are kind of just moving beyond the concept stage. But it's stuff that I'm actively working on now, and I'm excited to get feedback on it and to talk about it. So yes, so there's that. So even though I'm here talking about, I feel my voice is really loud. Even though I'm here talking about kind of captured elements within games, I do a bunch of other stuff too, which I'm probably not going to talk about. I do that, and I do this. Sometimes I do one of these, and I make other games that don't have anything to do with capture. But what I really wanted to focus on today was talking about different reasons why elements that we describe as being captured or indexical, since we're all on board with this word now. Indexicality is a semiotic concept, which the best way I could probably describe it is that the thing that you're referring to has some sort of connection with, oftentimes a material connection with the representation. So something like a shadow is indexical because when you look at a shadow, you don't think of it as being an absence of light on something. You think of it as being whatever the thing that casting the shadow is. And in media, this is often really, we tend to talk about things that are indexical as being captured elements. And it kind of separates some of the things that we do with games with some of the other media forms that we're really familiar with. And this became really relevant to me when I was looking at things like documentary video games, because documentary is really focused on this captured element of it. And I was trying to find ways in which games could still capture dominant aspects of indexicality or capture, even though games tend to fall more into what we talk about as being created media. And I mean, generally the difference between the two is, when we talk about things that are media forms that are indexical, we talk about them as being taken or captured or recorded. So if you think of the ways we talk about photographs or film or video, there's this real sense that we aren't really making anything to get that representation. We're like taking it from the world. We're ripping some aspect from life, and it's like immediately transferred into the representation somehow. Now, there's obviously huge problems with that when you start to think about it a lot more, but the way that we kind of generally talk about it and perceive it kind of has that quality to it. So, but then when we start talking about games, we almost fall into this different category where it's more about create. So games, models, simulations, they're all made. You make a simulation. You create you build a model. You make a game. You create a game. We don't really talk about games as being taken, captured, or recorded in any way, except in a couple of circumstances, which I'm increasingly thinking just are really interesting. So there's actually a number of reasons why games have fallen into this category rather than this other category. And some of them are just technical. It's harder to bring the captured material into games in a way that retains this really great mutability and flexibility that we are used to seeing when we deal with games. So for example, I mean, this is sort of one of the factors that led to this kind of rejection of these integrated full motion video games that were really popular around the mid to late 90s. So CD-ROM and DVD-ROM games, it's this big burst of games that integrated all of this kind of full motion video, actual characters. And there's a real backlash against all of this sort of thing in games, so much so that it kind of became something that you just didn't do. And you can still kind of see that a little bit today when people talk about when people come out really heavily against cutscenes and things like that. This sense that games are about interaction, and when you put video into a game, or you put other types of captured media into a game, then you're going against what games are. You're trying to be a movie or something. Now, admittedly, some of the kind of early full motion video games are hilariously bad or just wonderfully charming. I think Phantasmagoria probably falls into that wonderfully charming category. But as you kind of see from the very first slide that I put up, it sort of was a meme to go and Photoshop yourself into the game, because it's sort of, it looks a little bit clunky, a little bit like not what we kind of presume from games. And then with things like, the X-Files game and things like that, part of the reason why any of this material was actually brought into the games in the first place was so that you could say specific people were in the game. So you could say the real actors from the X-Files were actually in the X-Files game. And that still kind of persists in games today, except it focuses more on voiceover work and some other sort of examples that I'm showing. I'm going to show a little bit later. The second reason why we kind of moved away from this, and I guess it's somewhat related, but again, I kind of touched on it before, it's more theoretical. It's this idea that games that incorporate captured material like film and video and indexical audio and that kind of thing, we're trying to be something that they're not. You're not appreciating games if you're integrating all of this stuff. You're just trying to make an interactive movie or something. And there was sort of a theoretical element that emerged during this. It was kind of called the ludology versus narratology debate. Narratology, I suppose, would probably be best categorized in it as bringing in other forms, looking at games from the perspective of other forms of media. So, to be honest, whether or not they're narrative or not. So, and that backlash, again, kind of fed its way into game education. So again, you kind of get this game education that gets people to move away from integrating elements that are seen as being not game-like because they're not fully interactive. So that being said, we still have, even today, and increasingly so, a whole bunch of games that actually use indexical elements or captured elements within the games. And there are particular genres where it's really important as well. So this is kind of where I've become really interested in terms of the kind of indie games that I've been looking at and the ones that I've been trying to create. Particularly these games where captured elements are really important to either that genre of game or what that game's trying to do, or the effect that it's trying to create. And there's a number of different kind of areas that you can see in indie games where you get captured elements and they do certain things. So for example, social value. So you get games like Caho's game and other sorts of games where that take advantage of integrated camera technologies. So for example, things like the Kinect, or things like even just iOS devices that everything has a camera in it now. So you can incorporate a lot of these video and photographs and things into games, and they do become kind of more accessible for people to use. And the reason why you get a game like My Ninja Shadow Warrior is so fun. There's many reasons why, but one reason why that I will pick is that it takes a photo of you when you're in these really awkward positions that kind of constitute the game. And that photo has social value. And in the context where you play the game, those are hilarious photos, and sometimes somewhat shocking photos, and sometimes great blackmail photos. But the fact that they are photos of people playing the game, that they are the real positions that those people were in, or like the real crazy things that they did in order to actually to create those different shapes, is an essential part of the game. If you just had like animated characters who were in those positions, even if they kind of looked like, or even if you had to pick your avatars, it would not have anywhere near the same effect. And again, and a lot of these games that take photos of you in various positions kind of have that same quality to them. The fact that it's a photo of a real person is really important. Documentary games, which is kind of where I came into this from, are also rely heavily on kind of captured elements within games, but they're still kind of negotiating what counts as a captured or a documented element. And some games sort of do more in this regard than others. So For example, you get more recent games like Peter Brinson and Kurosh Valalajad as Cat in the Coup, which is a documentary game documenting the CIA-led coup. Sorry? Okay. About of the first of the democratically.
Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected leader of Iran, and then he was replaced by a Shah.
Yes.
In the 50s, and then eventually people rose against him in 1979, and that's where we get the current government of Iran.
Yes, but this is the game.
This is a game about. I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. I can go back to it afterwards too. I mean, the important quality from the perspective of captured elements is that they integrate all of these photographs and documentation of the from kind of historical sources in it. And as you go through, it actually increasingly incorporates more of that material. So
it's providing historical context.
Yes.
Okay, I apologize.
No. So this is sort of one way in which documentary game makers kind of add that element of capture of indexicality to some of the works that they're putting together. By far, it's not the only way. There's actually a whole bunch of different techniques that don't necessarily kind of incorporate indexical elements, but in particular, because they're trying to position themselves as being documentary. Documentary, in a weird sense, is almost about its own ability to capture and document things. Like if you think about it, all film captures images from the world. Well, most film does. But you could still have a completely fictional film that captures images from the world. Of course, that's fairly common. What documentary does is it's specifically about the actuality of those images that it's kind of capturing. So, and it's one bit where games they can kind of fall short because a lot of things in games aren't taken from the world, they're created. Another sort of kind of approach that documentary games kind of do is looking at things like simulation as possibly having this sort of digital indexical quality that can constitute capture in some way. So, for example, the core physics engine, or the core physics behind the ballistics, or the shooting simulation in JFK Reloaded, which is a kind of an older documentary game, is backed by essentially the game maker's argument that it's created from the forensics that are in the Warren Commission report. So the kind of indexical argument that they're trying to make there is that as long as you have faith in that core data, the physics is fairly immutable and fairly simulable. So you can take this as being an indexical element of this particular work. Now, the interesting thing about simulation is that depending on where you get your data from and how it's actually constructed, some simulations you would see as being captured, and some simulations you would see as being entirely constructed. So it really depends on the context that it's actually played in and what they're trying to do. Performance capture is another element where, it's called performance capture. Significant. We don't call it performance create or performance model. The important element of performance capture is presumably that what we are seeing is somehow taken from the world and brought into a game. Now, there's different sorts of performance capture, and it doesn't necessarily, the dressing up with the little spandex suit with the ping pong balls all over it isn't necessarily the only kind of way you would do this. Even going back to things like rotoscoped elements. So, for example, the movement of the prince in Prince of Persia as a rotoscoped element is performance capture. And in this case, it's not specifically referring to somebody in the world, but the motion from that character has a distinct quality that often appears when you do rotoscoping. It captures essentially an excess of information that ties it to something material in the world. So in this case, it's just used to create more fluid, more realistic seeming motion in a character. But obviously in different kinds of games, there's different There's great video for that. So for example, music games are great for using captured material because if you think about it, most music games, most of these kind of re-performance music games at this time actually get you to recreate real songs. So they've actually created this whole set of gameplay around what we would formerly call almost analog material. I mean, that song doesn't change. The recording of that song is absolutely the same, but they've managed to design gameplay that surrounds it without actually changing this one long media element, which isn't terribly flexible, or else it wouldn't be the same song anymore. But also, in a lot of these these specialty performances for some of that, like for example, the Metallica version of the now defunct Guitar Hero, they have tons of documentation about how they brought the band in there and how they captured their performances. Some of the songs that are in there, I think there was one song that was released for it where the original recording is actually from this. It's not a reperformed song. They made the recording of the song that they used for this. They were kind of brought directly in there. So, and the reason why you kind of do things like this, and this is the ping pong thing, by the way, is again so they can say that not that this game recreates Metallica. It's, they could say yes, Metallica is in this game. It's totally them. It's there's things about this performance that if you really know Metallica, you will look at this and you will understand it. It's really popular. It's really an important aspect of various sports games. So, for example, in the Tiger Woods PGA Tour game, God, they have so much documentation of all aspects that they capture from Tiger Woods. So again, ping pong ball suit, with capturing the mechanics of Tiger Woods' swing. They incorporate like data and stats and things if you want to go for more data-centered indexicality. And then entirely separate facial capture to get these real expressions and these kind of real effects. So much data. I mean, this is such extensive documentation of Tiger Woods at this point in time that saying that this isn't documentary is, I think, really starting to skirt the lines of what we say that we can document. So why is this important to kind of indie game stuff? Well, right now, I mean, this sort of setup right here obviously is well beyond anything that anybody is going to put together. I mean, this is nuts. And oftentimes, I mean, there have been kind of examples of this sort of approach that in the end has ended up just being a financial disaster for various studios that have done it. But elements of it still kind of work their way into kind of indie games and indie production, and in particular with capture techniques, just using basic things like the Kinect, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. The second thing, the kind of final way that performance capture kind of plays its way into games of all sorts, like both kind of professional and kind of indie ones, is in games where it's important to capture the physicality of the person who's performing the game. And this isn't all motion games. In a lot of motion games, the gestural aspect doesn't necessarily have to tie into the physicality of the person who's playing it, as long as it kind of operates fine within the game world. But in some games, it's really important, in particular like fitness games, because if you think about it, the fitness game relies on capturing accurate information about how you're performing that fitness game. So, the sensors that they incorporate into something like the Wii balance board are there to capture things about you, your body position, how you're holding yourself, because that is kind of the aim for the game context that it's actually setting up. In games like Move, which I want to ask more, there might be some people who would know a little bit about that. The device is being used to tell you something about the physical, to capture elements of the physicality of the people who are participating in the game. So that idea that you're trying to capture whether or not somebody is moving at the same rate as somebody else, whether or not they're moving in the same kind of way with the same sort of intensity, is again, it's a capture element. It's not something that the game is inventing. It's actually really important that it tries to capture it as accurately as possible. So I've been playing around with these ideas in a number of different games that I'm working on, and most of them are kind of oriented towards trying to bring kind of a stronger documentary quality to various games. And this started out actually with just basic incorporation of things like video and photographs into game elements. So this was, I'm not going to play a lot of these examples because, again, they're really sketchy. They're sketchy. They're not fully developed and kind of implemented into game form or whatever. But this was a really early sketch that we did for a game that we didn't end up pursuing, but it was with a group that was doing urban renewal projects. And the mechanic that we were trying to explore was, I can't really see it that well. You'll be able to see it a little bit better in a sec. The mechanic we were trying to explore was the idea of a space becoming real as you as you went through and you would play it. So you would interact with the space in a certain way, and the more you interacted with it like it was a real space as opposed to a game space, the more that aspects of the environment would have these integrated photographic elements of it. So this was actually this was modeled from a photograph, and this is the photograph over on that side. But we were creating these spaces where they kind of extended photographs into the game environment, so we could bring the photographs back in. As it turns out, and you can kind of get a sense of it from this video, it was really hard to separate what was photographic and what was just really cleverly modeled. In some cases, there were some things you could really tell that it was a photograph or that it was created, and in other times the captured and created elements just completely blurred and it didn't work, and we had to come up with increased bizarre effects to try to separate out the two. So successful on that one, but some of that work kind of led into a set of sketches around a documentary game that I created called Grime. The idea behind Grime was to document the work of a UK-based reverse graffiti artist, this fellow named Moose, who essentially cleans designs into really filthy overpasses and bridges and these sorts of things. So rather than adding things, he just takes away the pollution and dirt and things that are already there. So initially, when the thing I was interested most in trying to get across with Grime was essentially making a connection between, you know how everybody, when you have like a smudge on like your iPhone or your iOS device and you just have to compulsively clean it off, or you have there's a count, there's you have a car and there's like a dirty window and you accidentally make a line in it and then you're just like, okay, now I'm going to draw a happy face, or, clean me or whatever. That there's this that has that really engaging tactile quality with making something clean. So I wanted people to re-perform some of the works essentially based on the documentation that Moose was doing. So, and that element kind of came into play over here. There was kind of a stencil system that was based on various scenarios that he had gone through, and here is sort of I again was playing with this idea of, as a reward, integrating bits of the documentation into the environment. I have a short video clip I can play that shows this a little bit more. But as I kind of went through and was doing it, I also started becoming more interested in finding ways in which I could actually bring Moose into the game. Because in particular, like as I was going through and working on this project, Moose is just an amazing character to document, aside from this whole process. And essentially what he does is he will go and he will show people how to do this kind of thing, and then he will talk about different projects that he's done as he's helping people create these different stencils in life, not in the but if you think about that scenario, I mean, that's this classic, NPC helper character behavior that would be perfect to kind of integrate into the game. So, but unfortunately, it's almost impossible to capture somebody like that and bring them into a game environment. Even though I'm kind of increasingly trying to figure out ways, particularly cheap and easy ways to do that. At the time when I was working on this, the easiest way that I could do it was doing rotoscoping in Unity. So, sorry. But, and this is just a really, So we sort of rotoscoped him into a couple of places. This is kind of the environment that you are involved in. This is the stenciling. There's another. This is, I'll show this one because. So this is kind of the recreation of one of the documentation photos. It's got these 3 kind of mutant Mickeys in one area. So if you went through the game, so the scoring would work. There's a number of different ways that the scoring was implemented, but you could get bonuses for doing things that recreated aspects of the real environments. So for example, you can kind of see I'm accumulating my bonus stars at the top. But by recreating that, it brings the photo into the game. I had to do things like put the photo border around it and things, again, because of what I was saying before. But then you have this nice sort of persistent wall. Whoops. So, and then I ran out of money. But, and also, just as I kind of went through it, I just there has to be a better way to do some of these things. So that game kind of put aside a little bit. I started working on this other game, and this one is really I actually just like 2 days ago I lost my collaborator on it for reasons of technical complexity. But I'll explain it to you as a documentary work. So the game's called Petals, and the scenario for the gameplay essentially is that you have a number of, that you play a flower store owner, and you have a number of kind of people who come into the store, all women, and, well, actually no, women, some groups of people occasionally, sometimes couples, and they ask flowers, they ask for flowers from you, but most of the flowers that you give that you have in kind of your store are imperfect. So depending on kind of the general sort of, this what?
Nothing.
So the depending on there's a kind of general set of parameters that the customers kind of have coming in, including things like their determination, and oftentimes they'll come in with a particular sort of flower in mind that they are that they're looking for. So what you can do as sort of the flower store owner is go through and trim the flowers that you have in order to kind of to match this one perfect flower that people are requesting. Anyway, the game is about labiaplasty. And one of the kind of central things that I'm trying to do with the game that's kind of key is bring in this captured element of women's labia. In particular for this game, because one of the central sort of issues that comes up with cosmetic labiaplasty is that women oftentimes don't have a really good sense of what female genitals look like, aside from their own, sometimes not even their own. So, and in part, this project was inspired by conversations I had with an animator. Her name is Ellie London. She did a really good animated documentary called Centerfold. And in Centerfold, she went through, and again, she had this aspect of, it's the one up at the top. So she was telling the stories of people who come in for labia surgery, but she was also trying in the animation itself to kind of recreate aspects of women's genitals to bring into the game. So I've been talking with folks, including things that there's this great wall of vagina that an artist from the UK has put together. And what I would like to do with this game is essentially have the flowers that you would mostly view from the side, but when you go through and you're actually doing the trimming of it, you would view from top down, would all be captured from real women's labia. And part of the reason why the indexicality is important to it is because I can come up with essentially created women's genitals, and I can make them all different shapes and sizes. But it's important, in particular, if the problem is that people don't know what other people's genitals look like, and that's one of the things that feeds into this problem, that you can say in the game that every flower is actually based on a real woman's labia. And as you can see, flowers, they're probably a fairly good way of communicating this. Incidentally, the game would not actually explicitly say that it's about labiaplasty, and now nobody here can say anything, including camera people. So that's one kind of project that I'm currently working on. And by the way, the technical issue is that it's actually fairly difficult to do the kinds to do both the slicing and have the cloth physics that we actually need to do what we wanted to do. But not an insurmountable problem, design issue. One of the other things I'm looking at, and this is actually in context of both of the projects that I just talked about, is some of the work that, I don't know if folks know the Clouds people because they're here, or even if they're here, I don't know, I don't think so. So there's a kind of small group of people who have started experimenting with using the Kinect as a filmmaking tool. In part, again, sort of not using the Kinect as being this kind of performance capture in terms of moving things on an interface, but actually using it as a capture device for things like 3D scanning and whatnot. And so one of these projects is the documentary Clouds, which combines a digital SLR camera with a Kinect, and there's sort of a software matching element on the back to essentially create these sort of deep films that are kind of hybrids between a 3D model and kind of a high-resolution video image on the top. You can't really do that with just the Kinect because the camera that the Kinect comes with is really terrible. But there's other sort of projects that essentially take that same sort of approach but use different tools to work with it. So, so there's actually some really nice videos out there that do things like this one right here, which I'm not going to show, but if you have a chance to track it down, it's gorgeous. It looks really good. Uses a Kinect and Kinect processing, Cinema 4D. So it actually brings it into a modeling program, and then they do some tweaking with it with After Effects and that kind of thing. But the thing is that these things all kind of get to a point where they could be 3D models. And if they are in the form where they're 3D models, then they could be brought into games. And so I think the next stage would be to kind of experiment with things that you would perhaps want to capture using some of these techniques, but bringing into a game engine or a game environment. So that's currently what I'm exploring with some of this stuff. And with that, I have been built. This is my rig. It's my kit. So I've been trying to put together essentially a documentary field kit that incorporates the Kinect. I have a Zoom recorder. I am actually anxiously awaiting this portable power device to essentially just get a really small, entirely portable documentary field kit that can essentially try to take 3D images of things. And in terms of both of those projects that I talked about that I was working on, I mean, I could bring it, I could actually finally document moose for grime. I could go to the Great Wall of Vagina and I can get myself some vaginas. There's no subtle way to say that. But anyway, so, but what's I think more exciting about this technology setup is that the Kinect actually doesn't do a terrible job at doing motion capture, which is actually kind of amazing for how much it costs and how many people have access to it. And I think that it's why a lot of people are really playing around with it right now. I mean, we're far from perfect, but it is in a way far better than it has any right to be, based on the way that we've commonly been thinking about motion capture. So it kind of excites me that you can put together a kit like this for a reasonable amount of money for doing independent game development as opposed to being an EA who has this huge motion capture sports studio. And you can actually experiment with different ways in which you can bring captured elements into games. So I was told that I was supposed to like lead off with some sort of big rallying call or whatever. Which I'm really not very good at. So, but if I was to come up with one, it would probably be to look at ways to capture things rather than just solely focus on create. That's my talk.
Awesome. So for those of you who don't know, Andy Nealon normally hosts this thing. And what he does is sort of kick things off with questions for the speaker that might be things you might be wondering yourselves, and then we sort of segue over to you and your questions. So Cindy's going to come join me over here. I don't know which light switch. I feel like we should light this better. Here we go. Okay. So one question that I had that wasn't in your talk was how you wandered into the realm of indexicality games in general. You hinted at that it sort of came out of documentary games, but what got you so interested in this approach or this angle?
It was kind of the one takeaway from doing the documentary game stuff that I actually was particularly interested in. That there was because in part, when I started looking at documentary video games, the most common reason for why that genre didn't seem to really be able to take hold was often things like, oh, well, documentary people don't understand games. And this is absolutely 100% true. But it actually was kind of was covering up this larger technical issue that had to do with the way that people related to the technologies that were going into both of these things. So that part, for me, was really fascinating, because even if you weren't going to make a documentary video game, lacking this element of capture and all of these different ways in which we have media where capture is a really important part, was all of a sudden relevant to for all different sorts of games and kind of a whole different set of things that you could do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you pointed out the whole Tiger Woods capturing him and sort of somehow grasping a bit of his essence. But then I think it's interesting when you talk about the reel, that for a lot of AAA video game makers, it's chasing the reel is more about making realistic looking things, or boobs that bounce in the perfect way, or just use another female body part reference can become a marketing feature. It's how would you relate that kind of chasing the reel to this notion of indexicality? I mean,
it's sort of it's to a certain extent. I mean, there's definitely rhetorical elements that go into this. I mean, there's there's oftentimes some really fine, shifty distinctions that people are making with things. I mean, weirdly, it's almost easier to kind of explain it in terms of film stuff. Like, so for example, if you get you can have a film that is really meticulously researched and recreated. So for example, an example I often use is like the Omaha Beach scene from Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
And when that came out, a lot of people were like, "Oh, well, veterans shouldn't watch this. They're going to go into PTSD." And it's highly accurate. And they did tons of research, and it's just like that experience. But no matter how much research or effort they could put into that, they can't make it documentary.
Right.
Because it doesn't have that captured element. And in order to make a documentary, they'd have to integrate some sort of captured element into it. So like in the TV show, they have, like veteran interviews will overlay,
right.
kind of be juxtaposed with some of the scenes and things. And the same thing kind of comes through with games. I think in particular, like let's say for example with the Tiger Woods game or the Metallica game, if you see some of the promos for that Guitar Hero Metallica game, or any of the other sorts of games, music games, where they did this kind of performance capture with people, they really push, not that it is really like Metallica or it's really like Paramore or any of these other people that they had. It's that it is that band. So that's sort of the distinction with the capture, is that it is that band. That is Tiger Woods.
Yes.
That's not a really accurate kind of animated model of Tiger Woods. That's Tiger Woods. He was in there, and that's if you know Tiger Woods and you look at those facial expressions, you'll be like, oh damn,
that really is Tiger. Whoa.
Yeah.
Which is a different question. I mean, the traces you were pointing out in Kaho's game, or even this project you're doing with the blossoms. Sometimes you can't tell who it is in a photo, or sometimes you don't even want anyone to know it was you. So there's another sense, I suppose, in which things could be tethered.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily. I mean, certainly realisticness often plays a part in it, but it doesn't have to rest on realisticness. That's kind of why I left the slide in there from Prince of Persia.
Yeah.
Because in a weird way, that one is a real world reference that captures parts of a digital experience. At least the way that kind of because when Jordan Mechner he put a blog out that with all of his documentation from putting together the Prince of Persia, which included things like the little those videos of the rotoscoping sessions that he did with his brother. And if you've played a lot of Prince of Persia, you can watch those videos and you can go, that's that's the character from the Prince of Persia. You can see that in from the video. Like it's indexical back to the video game.
Yeah.
And that has nothing to do with realisticness of the depiction. It's like it's a quality of the motion that you can see in the video, which is kind of interesting.
Well, and I liked how you used that phrase, an excess of information that ties it to something in the real world. And I think that ties into, you were talking about tools that for so long computers had a struggle to have enough processing power to handle anything that messy. So I suppose we're in a stage where you could have an excess of the real that's sort of leaking into the video game. So I mean, you mentioned your field kit, which looks amazing, and I bet a bunch of people are going to want to use it. I mean, are there other tools? There are people in the crowd who are curious or interested in tool making, or might want to know about other things that could help them explore indexicality. Are there other things you would point to that they should check out?
I think the people who are doing the RGBD toolkit are doing a really good job at trying to make the stuff that they're putting together accessible. Like it's all kind of open source stuff. They run tons of workshops and things. They're really explicit about people taking that stuff and doing other things with it, aside from what they're doing with it, which I think is fantastic. They're also they do their own toolkit for the filmmaking, but their purpose is to try to take it away from being this really specialized high-tech thing and bringing it more into allowing people to just use it without being obsessed with the graphics programming and stuff, which is great from my perspective because weirdly, like I'm a 2D game designer, and how I waded into like crazy 3D stuff that's all like based on data clouds and whatever just I don't know how I got into this mire.
Deep water. The one last thing I wanted to bring out before we go to the audience is that during our conversation getting ready for this, you said that documentary people are techies, actually kind of extreme techies, and I'm curious about that, right? That, documentary filmmakers, that's a techie crowd.
Game people are just extreme techies. But documentary is I see it as being a very tech genre, particularly now. Weirdly, when I was doing documentary game stuff, and I mentioned this to you when we were talking before, but when I started doing documentary game stuff, the documentary community is still very wary of games, and part of the reason why is that documentary is going through this huge revival of interest in participants, and in particular, interactive documentary just has they're doing tons of interesting things that are more like films, so a lot of people are more comfortable with it. But in a way, they don't have to do game stuff because they are doing so well. If they were doing poorly and they needed to be more relevant and they needed to be kind of more engaged in digital things.
There's like a revival of interest in the genre within film itself.
But there are tons of experiments with different sorts of kind of digital technologies and stuff. I mean, the clouds, it's a documentary. It's sort of exploring the use of the Kinect. There's tons of kind of database documentaries. Different sorts of kind of interactive documentary modes and things. And just in documentary itself, I mean, like when I was saying that, I mean, it's in a way, it's about a camera. It's about being able to point a camera at something and calling the thing that you get real. That's has nothing to do with why people make documentaries, but at a certain kind of core, fundamental level, there's that presumption is embedded in all documentary.
Right.
And as you kind of go through the history of documentaries change depending on the technologies that are available. I mean, when you get portapacks, all of a sudden you get observational documentaries.
I see what you mean.
When you get cheap cameras and capture devices, now you have all these great crowdsourced documentaries where you can just give everybody a camera, or you can take images from YouTube.
Animal cam shots.
You can attach a camera to your cat and make a documentary about their day.
Your cat sitting on your robot, etc.
Yeah, but there's a documentary robot actually that they debuted, I think, in at the last documentary.
Docu-drone.
Yeah. So there's this connection between technology and documentary that's fairly interesting. And then, like I said, it's just not they're not as techie as games people, but
techie in a different way. Maybe we could appropriate some of their techiness. You guys have questions for Cindy? Syed. Oh yeah, okay. For documentation purposes, please use the mic.
Oh, okay. Hi, Cindy. So I had a question about the level of capture, like as a game designer, how much capture you want in the game. So to me, there's like a few spectrums. There's Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is like, really great simulation, but the most boring game, at least for me, I've ever encountered. And then there's like a game like Button, where has absolutely lacks complete any kind of capture. And I have this funny story where I went up to the MIT Media Lab, and we put up Button. And Media Lab is, it's focused around capture, around like sensors, and the whole community there is just about like, getting all that data from people and then doing something cool with it. And there was one, so if people don't know what Button is, it's this game where you get these prompts and you do something and then you run to a button and you have to press it X amount of times. And one of the prompts was like, act like an alligator. And then people started acting like an alligator. And then it said, act like a crocodile. And then everyone's face they're like, but then how is it no? And they were just like looking around the room, literally searching for the sensor to be accurate enough to act like an alligator. And everyone laughed. But it was just, I guess I generally, I wanted to know, as a designer, what level of capture you're looking for in a game, or how to decide that, really.
I think it just really depends on what you want to do with it. One of the experiments that I kind of want to look at is essentially how little you can capture and still have it being recognizable as being captured. And I think that's sort of the key thing for me, is just that spark of recognition where it's like that's indexical, that's captured, that was taken from an environment somewhere. And I mean that oftentimes is something that's set up in a game, that kind of relationship. But oftentimes too, it's just recognizable. Like you can look at something and say that took information from somewhere, and you can get these sort of false positives, like with the Button example, where it's like it seems like it might be captured, so you're looking and trying to figure out where it's getting that information from, and it doesn't actually have to be true, but that effect is still there in that way. But in terms of how important that effect is, it just depends on the type of game that you're making. Like even if you think about, like I talked about, games like Cow's games that use photography, where you can kind of clearly see that it's a captured image from a person. But even if you think about games like this, like Fruit Ninja, where your shadow is there, and I mean it's clearly your shadow. It's like goes back to like this core like indexicality thing with like the shadow. But clearly it doesn't look like you, except that it looks like your outline, and we're familiar with what shadows look like. But it's enough information to have that quality to it. So you're captured and you're in the game and you're slicing fruit, like you do.
Pass over the microphone.
So all of these examples, and like when I think of examples of like other types of captures, deals with like taking real world data or people and capturing them into like the digital vernacular of like polygons and skeletal animation. And when I think about like video or photographs in games, it automatically like seems almost cheesy or something, like it doesn't fit somehow into that world. So why do you think there's this aversion? And maybe I don't know if I'm the only person who experiences it, but I feel like it might be like a common thing when you think like when you see a real element in this digital game, it seems like almost out of place.
I mean with it's about Phantasmagoria. It does sort of have this odd quality, but it depends on. It depends on the design of the game too. I mean, when you see games like the Cat and the Coup, you don't get that kind of same cheesy effect when it integrates photographs and things. So to a certain extent, it is kind of a design thing. I think it's also it has that part of it is this lingering historical thing that ties back to the CD-ROM and DVD-ROM games. Which in many ways were just actively cheesy, and it just has this bad aftertaste of that's what full motion video in games is all about. So I mean, a part just might be kind of aesthetic preferences in some ways, but I don't know necessarily that it's sort of like an innate quality that's kind of built into it.
Like quick follow like even in your with the moose thing, like you chose to rotoscoping rather than just tapping.
Yeah, because it looks ridiculous if you do it. Well, I mean, there's a, from in terms of my aesthetic decision there, I mean, there's certain things in terms of people just have kind of a different sort of phenomenological orientation towards video and images and animation. So it's hard to blend. We just relate to those spaces differently. Like when you watch an animated film, you kind of come in understanding that world in some way. And when you watch a movie or something, you understand that world in kind of a different way. So in part, blending those is sort of confusing because you don't know whether or not elements that are photographic are supposed to be real or whether or not they're just in there. Because we can use those images even though they're sort of technically indexical as like any fiction film, that we just use it as being fictional. So it can be kind of create this sort of weird interpretive thing sometimes. But then oftentimes it's just things like the color palette and just the way the images look. They just don't aesthetically fit in very well. The rotoscoping just had this. It had enough of the capture quality that I wanted without having any of the aesthetic problems. So it had a number of other problems in terms of having to make like every different frame of that rotoscope. But
I wonder if it ties it all into the uncanny valley stuff where the lack of reactivity in contrast to the detailed excess becomes startling,
Yeah.
Like he's not going to respond to you in a fluid way, and that causes an odd jolt.
Yeah. So and again, it depends on how you're using it too. So and I mean a lot of those games that incorporate photographs and video. I mean they do it because they look silly and because they're photographs and video and that kind of thing. So that could be an aesthetic choice that you kind of intentionally make.
Sure.
First of all, sorry about all the interruptions earlier.
Oh, it's okay.
Second of all, have you noticed that in a lot of mainstream games there are also some elements of capture, or at least like back in the previous generation? I mean the PS2 era. I mean, for instance, games like Tecmo's Monster Rancher, where you had to where it actually read information off of like CDs and DVDs you had, and for instance, Tony Hawk's I think it's Tony Hawk's Underground, where it actually it actually captured your face from like a passport photo and actually put you in the game. Do you think there's more of that now, or do you think there's less of that?
I think there's I think there's more of it with there's more of it from more like smaller independent games, and the reason why is because the technology is just more readily accessible. There's just more possibilities to do that sort of thing because again, like I said, cameras are in everything, and there's different peripherals that kind of measure that kind of information. But yeah, there's always been like spots where it kind of pops up like in different bits from kind of AAA titles. Tended not to be kind of a huge, I mean, it always kind of had this novelty quality to it, but it was definitely like noticeable. It's one of those things where when you use it, it can have a lot of impact because a lot of people don't use it. But I would actually love to talk to you after. I'll give you my card because I'm fanatical about all of those examples, and I need to know.
Just asking about like the capture technology. I think it's really incredible, especially with games such as like LA Noire, that has just such an incredible kind of depth of capture. I guess my question is, it's interesting because like in LA Noire, it kind of pushes it to the realism aspect. Where I was actually at a talk with Kim Perlin at NYU where he was talking about kind of drone noise, and he was kind of showing tech examples where these more randomly procedural kind of animated figures kind of displayed more realism than some of the capture technology that that is out today. So how do you feel about like kind of that intersection between like full-on motion capture and using more, I guess, like randomized procedural generated technology?
Well-
And, like, do you see kind of an intersection between those two eventually, or?
What's interesting is that, okay, on one level they're two separate things.
Okay.
You can have something that's created and incredibly realistic and can seem more realistic than things that are captured, and oftentimes these things sort of have kind of different qualities to them. And you can kind of get that in animation too. Like sometimes you can get like a really talented animator capture aspects of motion, where if you rotoscoped it, or use performance capture, it just looks weird. It doesn't look right for some reason. And weirdly, it often looks weird because it actually has more information than we actually want and not how we expect that information to look. So there's sort of that aspect. But then there's this other kind of, there's this intermingling between this created and captured elements. And actually the motion capture and the performance capture stuff is a really good example, because when you start to look at the back end of how that data comes from the person and makes its way into the model, there is so much creation that goes on in that space. It's just unbelievable. And I use an example from when I was working on Grime. One of the aspects, or one of the experiments, the little prototypes they put together, was originally supposed to be the walls in the game. What I wanted to do was I wanted to take environmental data from where those walls kind of existed in the different environments. So for example, I went and got like Brighton environmental data to try to bring it into kind of one of the walls from the Brighton sequence. So I got the data, which was in this weird, it's all numbers that don't really mean anything. I clearly want to say something with it, so I became really aware of, well, what am I saying with this? Because a lot of that data, you can make an argument that, okay, well, the environment's polluted and the wall will become polluted faster because the environment's polluted. But then but if I'm going to make that argument procedurally, I really had to think about, well, what elements am I saying do that? And are there elements that don't do that I'm implying do? I mean, maybe those walls are really dirty because a lot of cars go by and kick up dirt. Maybe there's just maybe it's a really dusty place. So there was that level. Then I had to take the data and actually bring it into a form that I could actually use in terms of affecting the wall in certain ways and deciding, what's the rate of change and how is it. By the time I actually got from where I wanted to be at the end, I, as a creator, felt I had lost any sense of that I was actually capturing anything and that I wasn't creating things from scratch. And that's sort of a kind of an interesting flip side to some of this stuff. I mean, in a way, documentary film also, when we talk about the transparency of putting a documentary film camera, in front of somebody and saying that you're actually capturing that real person. But it works on the point of view of creators too. I mean, that you don't have to know how the camera works. You just have to point the camera at somebody. Creates that illusion when you actually go to make like a documentary film, or you do a recording, or you take a photograph, or anything like that. And a lot of people are very aware of what the technology is actually doing, and I love that stuff. So I like to be that person. But you can't deny that those technologies also create this sense of transparency on the part of view of people too. And so for like some of that stuff, I felt that I completely lost that transparency. And I don't know if that meant creating tools that weirdly obscure how the SLR, digital SLR Connect, camera hybrid or whatever, that somehow just brings it in and gives you a model in like Unity or something, and hides all of the weird little negotiations that need to go on in between. It's an ethical question in terms of how you want to make that technology and what people want it to do, and which is really really interesting, because when you get down to it, I mean, it's not purely captured, it's captured. It's like this mingling where it doesn't even really mean, you can't even really distinguish what is sort of made up and what's not made up. And
Oh, that's very interesting.
Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. In your rallying cry at the end, which you don't stand behind completely, but you said to capture more and to create less.
I should totally stand by it. That's what I'm gonna
So here's your chance.
do. It, every one of you. I want to see.
So why should we do that? What does that enable that we don't have from creating? That's not an attack on it, but I'm just kind of curious. What can we do with this that we can't do now?
Well, in part, that's what I was kind of trying to get at with some of the examples that I was showing. I mean, it's something that functions. There's a couple of particular functions that it performs really well, and that's sort of where you tend to see it. So, for example, like in the social games, being able to tie it back to specific people and having that part of that social scenario where it's funny and it's kind of a souvenir of foolish behavior. That serves an important function in that kind of game. In documentary games, it's important because documentary games still struggle with being able to say that they're documenting anything. And particularly because you run into problems with how much simulations actually capture and what you're saying and what you're capturing and that kind of thing. So and again, documentary film gets a huge pass on this in a lot of cases. So that's sort of why it could be interesting in that area. What was the other? Oh, and then just various sort of performance capture games. I mean, they don't necessarily. I mean, we don't think about sports games and music games as being documentary games. Really, they're sort of their own genres, but they definitely have. I mean, it's important for us to be able to say that bits of them are captured for some reason, and I'm not even really sure why. But it does make me wonder. Then, well, what other things are like? What other for some reason, it's always these performance things. Like, what other performance aspects do we want to be able to kind of to say are captured within a game? So.
And there's that sense in all your examples. I mean, you began with these documentary games that games sometimes get accused of being off in a fantasy world, and doing this kind of capture may pull a tighter connection for people who can't relate to it. Just like, oh, I don't watch cheesy Hollywood films, but I love documentaries. Maybe there will be people who really get into documentary style capture games,
yes,
right?
We can be snobs. We can be capture snobs. There's my rallying cry. Be a capture snob.
Be a capture snob. So, other questions before we've got one here in the front. I guess we should wait for the mic.
To answer now, could you explain the process that you follow to create a game, maybe just to pursue the idea? How do you do it?
So it depends on what, like for these particular games, because they're specifically coming out of like my interest in indexicality and capture. The games are built around the things that are being captured, which is a sort of a backwards way. I don't design any other game like that. So it's but for the most part, like, it's sort of forced me to try to think of different sorts of game mechanics and dynamics that work with this form of material. So, I mean, like I was saying, like with the music game genre is entirely built around gameplay that accepts these elements without changing it. And so a lot of the, for whatever reason, I think because it actually feeds in with captured material, but a lot of the mechanics that seem to work really well are things like the kind of beat matching, pattern matching. Those sorts of things, because they're sort of designed already to work around, what we would kind of formally call analog material. But I mean, even like just like my dream of having, being able to bring like a documentary character into a game as an NPC. I mean, that's something that could, you could design a ton of different sorts of games around that. That could easily just be like a branching game or a mission-based game or.
That's an awesome design challenge. I'm gonna spread around GDC.
Real NPCs. Well, so the thing with the NPCs though too is that we have this constrained sense of what they do, and the function that they kind of serve, and in some cases it just fits.
They're vending machines. Like the joke is you put the coin in and you get the soda.
But weirdly, I mean that's sort of and typically you don't want to think about people that way. But in terms of grime, I mean that person, that character, that fits with what his kind of interaction
actual real life persona.
And he's not a vending machine of information. He's actually part of the reason why I would want to have him in there is that he's just like a great character. I mean, he just is a ready font of stories that relate to different things that you would be doing. But it matches with that kind of that kind of dynamic as well.
He can kind of narrow himself into a trope that's understood in game world.
Yeah, without it seeming tropey. And
Yeah.
and the other thing too is that he doesn't, that in that role we don't expect much from. I mean, if I was doing a kind of a reverse graffiti work and he was telling me some story about what he was doing, I wouldn't be trying to get behind him or trying to get him to ask him weird questions or to hand off things to him. So that sort of, that lack of flexibility doesn't, it also matches with that situation.
Mm-hmm. I know exactly.
So in some cases it works. It's hard from a documentary sense to figure out. I still haven't really got a great handle on how to go from a kind of a scenario that I would want to present and gameplay, because oftentimes it just doesn't work. I've had people present ideas to me that, I would love to make a documentary game about X, and you can't for the life of you think of a way that it would actually function, aside from this sort of like choice-based strategic kind of decision-making type thing, which isn't my favorite sort of gameplay. But
so that's an interesting terrain for the indie community and the audience, is thinking about how is there such a thing as an indexical game mechanic, or how do you start to tether to the real in ways that can mirror the capture stuff?
Yeah, and I think there's definitely particular structures that work better than others.
Cool. Well, I think maybe another round of applause for Cindy. Thanks so much for coming up.